My ex-husband's former girlfriend manipulated him into believing I was having an affair with my stepbrother. Worse still, she convinced him that my pregnancy was a result of that affair. A decade later, he wants to meet his child. But I have news that will shatter his world. I work as a geriatric care nurse at Oakwood Senior Living, and like most healthcare workers, I'm used to dealing with complex family situations. But nothing in my professional experience could have prepared me for the emotional storm I'm about to share. For clarity, and to help myself keep track of the names I'm using here, the key people in this story are myself, Marie, 32, geriatric care nurse; David, 37, my current husband and a family physician; Marcus, 34, my stepbrother and a corporate lawyer; James, 35, my ex-husband working in IT project management; and Sarah, 33, James' ex-girlfriend who works in marketing. At home, present day. I'm sitting at my kitchen counter, my nursing scrubs still on from my night shift, trying to process the news I just received. My hands are trembling slightly as I hold my phone, reading the message for the 10th time. After nearly 10 years of silence, James is looking for me and the child he once rejected. The irony isn't lost on me. As someone who spends her days helping families navigate difficult conversations about their elderly loved ones, I find myself struggling to find the right words to explain my own situation. This isn't just about sharing bad news. It's about reopening wounds I thought had long since healed. If you're just here to read about another person's life falling apart, or if you want to offer advice about handling anxiety, either is fine. I type, then delete, then type again. I need to get this out, and maybe writing it down will help me make sense of it all. The current situation, stripped down to its basics, is this. My ex-husband has been asking mutual acquaintances about me. He wants to see me, and what he believes is his child. One simple sentence that carries the weight of years of pain and misunderstanding. When I was 24, I made what seemed like a brave decision at the time. I moved across the country with my best friend to start fresh in a new city. Looking back now, with the perspective my years in healthcare have given me about human nature, I can see all the red flags I missed. But back then, I was just a young nurse, eager to build a life of my own. 6 months after the move, the apartment felt emptier than usual that evening. My best friend had just accepted her dream job back in our hometown, a position at a prestigious hospital that she couldn't turn down. Of course, I encouraged her to take it. That's what best friends do, right? But sitting alone in our half-empty apartment, surrounded by the medical textbooks I was studying for my geriatric care certification, I felt more alone than ever. 2 weeks later, I met James. First meeting with James. I met James at a local coffee shop near the senior living facility where I worked. I just finished a particularly challenging shift. One of my favorite residents had taken a fall, and I was mentally exhausted from coordinating with the doctors and family members. I wasn't looking for a relationship. I was just trying to decompress before heading home. James was there for a client meeting. He worked as a project manager for a growing tech company that was developing healthcare management software. Our eyes met across the room when he overheard me talking to the barista about working in healthcare. He approached with genuine interest in my work, asking thoughtful questions about elderly care and the challenges we faced with digital medical records. I was vulnerable, emotionally drained from my job, and lonely in a new city. He was fresh out of a long-term relationship and eager to prove himself in his new management role. Looking back now, with years of experience observing family dynamics at work, I should have seen how our emotional states created the perfect storm for an intense but unstable relationship. Early relationship days. Within weeks, James was practically living in my apartment. We fell into an easy routine. I'd come home from my night shifts, and he'd be there with breakfast ready, eager to hear about my day. He'd work remotely from my living room, and I'd study for my certifications at the kitchen counter. It felt like we were building something real. You understand people in a way I never could, he'd tell me, watching me review my patient care notes. The way you handle difficult family situations at work. It's amazing. I was too blinded by what I thought was love to notice how he always seemed to check his phone when it buzzed, how he'd step out to take certain calls, how his expressions would change when particular messages came through. Graduation day. James' graduation from his IT management program came 3 months into our relationship. I arrived at the ceremony in my nicest dress, ready to support him. That's when I first met Sarah. Marie, this is Sarah. She's practically family. James' mother beamed, pulling forward a polished-looking woman in a designer dress. She and James grew up together, and she's doing amazing things in marketing now. Sarah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. James has told me so much about you, she said, her hand lingering on his arm. It's so noble, what you do, working with the elderly. I did what I always did at work when dealing with difficult family members, smiled professionally, and tried to keep the peace. It's wonderful to meet you, I replied, drawing on my years of experience in managing tense situations. Any friend of James' family is important to me. If only I'd recognized then how Sarah's presence would become a constant shadow over our relationship, like a slowly spreading infection that everyone ignores until it's too late to treat. At family gatherings, Sarah became an unavoidable presence at every family event. James explained that their families were too intertwined to exclude her. Their mothers were best friends. They shared the same social circles. She was just part of the package. You're so secure and understanding about this, he'd say, kissing my forehead after another dinner where Sarah had monopolized his attention. Most women would be jealous, but you're different. It must be because you deal with complex family dynamics at work. I'd smile and nod, ignoring the knot in my stomach, just like I ignored the way she used every opportunity to reference their shared history or touch his arm while laughing at inside jokes. I was used to navigating complex family situations at work, so I convinced myself I could handle this too. What I didn't realize then was that my professional experience in managing family conflicts was making me too diplomatic, too understanding. Sometimes, in healthcare, we learn to be so professional that we forget to protect ourselves. The proposal. 8 months into our relationship, James proposed. I later learned the timing wasn't coincidental. It was the same day Sarah announced her new marketing position at a rival tech company. But at the time, all I saw was the man I loved, spontaneously dropping to one knee in my small apartment after I'd finished a night shift. No ring. He said he wanted to propose so badly he couldn't wait to get one. As a nurse who'd seen countless families navigate both joy and heartbreak, I should have recognized this impulsivity as a warning sign. But I was too caught up in the moment, too eager to believe in this happiness. Wedding day. 1 year later, I walked down the aisle at a local church, my nursing colleagues filling several rows of seats. I hadn't seen my family in months due to my demanding schedule at the senior living facility. And suddenly, they were all there, watching me marry a man they barely knew. I was especially excited for James to properly meet Marcus, my stepbrother. As a corporate lawyer, Marcus had only managed to visit once before, during a business trip early in my relationship with James. The second time they met was at our wedding, where Marcus gave a heartfelt speech about growing up together. Sarah arrived in a white dress. I noticed, of course I noticed, but I handled it the way I handled difficult family members at work, with professional courtesy and careful restraint. Even when she monopolized the dance floor with James, I told myself it was fine. After all, I had danced with Marcus and my best friend too. That's what I did throughout my entire marriage. Applied my professional conflict management skills to personal situations where I should have stood my ground. Early marriage. For 2 years, I made excuses. When James prioritized Sarah, who he privately called obsessive and unstable when we were alone, I rationalized it. When his mother compared my practical nursing shoes to Sarah's designer heels, I smiled politely. When Sarah made snide remarks about my modest career choice, disguising them as concern, I maintained my professional composure. James had become my world, partly because my work schedule and his reluctance to travel meant I rarely saw my own family. My support network had shrunk to his social circle, and my colleagues at the senior living facility. The isolation crept up so gradually, like watching a patient's condition slowly decline while family members insist everything is fine. The pregnancy. Then came the pregnancy test, positive. As a healthcare worker, I'd helped countless families through moments of joy and crisis, but nothing prepared me for what happened next. James's first words weren't of joy or excitement. Instead, he said something that still echoes in my mind. She said this would happen. I can still remember standing in our bathroom, still in my scrubs from my shift, the positive test in my trembling hands, watching my husband's face transform from shock to suspicion. She warned me, and I should have listened. The confrontation. That night, James left our apartment without another word, ignoring my calls and messages. As a nurse who'd spent years helping families through crisis situations, I found myself unable to apply any of that experience to my own life. I sat on our couch all night, still in my scrubs, my phone clutched in my hand, watching the message notifications go unanswered. When he returned the next morning, his face was hard and unfamiliar. "You have two choices," he said, standing in our doorway like a stranger. "Abortion or divorce." The clinical part of my brain tried to stay professional, to handle this like I would a family dispute at work. But this wasn't work. This was my life shattering around me. When I finally got him to explain, the truth was worse than anything I could have imagined. Sarah had been feeding him lies for months, maybe years. During our wedding, she'd convinced him that Marcus and I were inappropriately close for step siblings. She'd analyzed every photo, every hug, every moment we'd spent together at the reception, twisting them into something sinister. "The way you two posed in family photos," James said, his voice cold. "The way you hugged him." Sarah showed me. It wasn't normal. She said you probably moved here because you were heartbroken when Marcus got engaged. The aftermath. I stood there in our kitchen, still wearing my name badge from work, listening to my husband repeat these accusations as if they were medical facts. Sarah had taken fragments of my relationship with Marcus from social media, comments, likes, old photos, and woven them into a nightmare narrative. "I'm a healthcare worker, James," I said, my voice shaking. "I understand the importance of evidence. I can show you the conception date from my medical records. It proves I was already pregnant before I visited my family. I'll take a paternity test." But he didn't care about evidence. The man who'd praised my professional judgment, who'd admired my ability to handle complex family situations, now refused to apply that same logical thinking to our own crisis. The decision. That evening, I did what I'd advised countless families to do in crisis situations. I reached out for support. I contacted my supervisor at Oakwood Senior Living and requested an immediate transfer to a facility closer to my family. Then I started packing. The divorce itself was surprisingly clinical, like discharging a patient who no longer needs care. James' mother had insisted on a prenuptial agreement, and our lack of joint assets made the separation straightforward. James refused any paternity testing and signed away his parental rights to our unborn child. I thought that was the end of our story. I was wrong. Present day. Now, nearly a decade later, I'm staring at my phone, reading messages from old colleagues warning me that James is trying to find me. He wants to meet his child, a child he once rejected without a second thought. David, my current husband, knows very little about James or how my previous marriage ended. As fellow healthcare professionals, he's a family physician. We understand the importance of patient privacy. I've respected his choice not to discuss his past relationships, and he's done the same for me. But as I sit here in our kitchen, still in my scrubs after a long night shift, watching the social media notifications multiply, I realize it's time to break that silence. Because James isn't going to stop until he finds what he's looking for, even though what he's looking for doesn't exist. 2 days later, I've been trying to keep this situation contained, like managing a sensitive case at work. But just as some medical situations escalate despite our best efforts, this one is growing beyond my control. 2 days after receiving the initial warning about James, my phone started buzzing with social media notifications. Follow requests began appearing on every platform: Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. I kept my accounts private, a habit I developed working in healthcare, where professional boundaries are crucial. But there he was, his profile picture modernized but unmistakable, trying to breach those boundaries. Though he hasn't sent any direct messages yet, I haven't accepted his requests. I can see him viewing my LinkedIn profile repeatedly. The platform's professional tracking features have become an unwelcome window into his determination. Evening at home. David, I said that night, still in my nursing scrubs after my shift, my hands wrapped around a cup of cooling tea. There's something I need to tell you about my past. My current husband, ever the composed physician, listened with professional attention as I unraveled my history with James. I detailed everything: the whirlwind romance, Sarah's manipulation, the pregnancy accusation, all of it. As I spoke, the follow requests kept appearing on my phone, like persistent symptoms that refused to subside. David's response wasn't what I expected. Instead of focusing on my past concealment, he immediately shifted into protection mode, much like when we coordinate patient care at work. "Let's handle this systematically," he said, his doctor's instincts kicking in. "First, we secure your privacy." Later that night, we spent the evening implementing digital barriers, blocking accounts, adjusting privacy settings, documenting everything like careful medical records. But just as some patients find ways around treatment plans, James found ways around our defenses. The messages started coming through fake accounts, each one more urgent than the last. They all carried the same theme. He had made a mistake. He wanted to meet his son. He needed to make things right. "A stepfather isn't the same as a biological father," one message read. "You of all people should understand that, Marie. You've always confused family relationships." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. As a geriatric care nurse, I'd seen countless examples of how love and care transcend biological connections. Every day, I witnessed both blood relatives who were strangers to each other and non-related caregivers who showed more devotion than any family member. Digital escalation. With each blocked account, James created another. His messages grew longer, more insistent. "You can't block me forever. I have rights. Our son deserves to know his real father." David held me as I trembled, reading the latest message. "We'll get through this," he promised, his doctor's certainty in his voice. "We've handled difficult cases before, but this wasn't just another difficult case. This was my past refusing to stay in the past, and I had a terrible feeling that digital harassment was only the beginning." Saturday morning. The morning started like any other weekend. I was heading to my mother's house, my nursing bag still in my car from yesterday's shift. Spencer, my son, was at a sleepover with his best friend, which was unusual for our Saturday routine. Normally, these weekly visits to Mom's were our special family time. I didn't notice the unfamiliar car across the street at first, or the man sitting in the driver's seat. It wasn't until I'd parked in Mom's driveway and stepped out that the situation registered. James was getting out of his car, walking toward me with the determined stride of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. The confrontation. Fear froze me for a moment, the kind of paralyzing fear I'd seen in families receiving difficult news at work. But then, something else took over. 10 years of working in healthcare, of dealing with crisis situations, of protecting vulnerable patients, all came rushing to the surface. "What are you doing here?" His question carried the same entitled tone as his messages. He was standing in my mother's driveway, a place he'd never visited during our marriage, a boundary he'd never cared to cross until now. The professional calm I usually maintained at work shattered. Years of suppressed anger erupted like a patient's long-ignored symptoms finally demanding attention. I found myself shouting, laying bare every manipulation, every betrayal, every moment he'd chosen Sarah's lies over my truth. His only defense was pathetic. Sarah manipulated me. I was vulnerable, and I believed my lifelong friend. Then came his explanation. Sarah had nearly gotten married recently, and in some pre-wedding moment of clarity, she'd confessed to her years of lies. The moment James learned the truth about my pregnancy, he'd started his search for me. The truth. "You want to know the truth, James?" My voice was steady now, the way it is when delivering difficult news to patients' families. "You don't have a child. The stress of your accusations, the divorce, the move. I lost the baby a few months after we separated." I watched the color drain from his face as I continued, "Spencer, the boy you've been trying to find? He's my stepson, David's son from his previous marriage. I adopted him legally. Yes, we both have red hair, a coincidence that became a running joke in our family. You were right about one thing. I do believe that love makes a family, not blood." The neighborhood was waking up now. My mother and stepfather had come outside, drawn by the commotion. Several neighbors stood watching from their porches, the kind of audience no one wants for their personal drama. When my stepfather firmly suggested James leave, he did, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd lost, what he'd thrown away for nothing. Standing there in my mother's driveway, still in my scrubs from the night before, I hoped this would be the end. But years of working in healthcare had taught me that some situations get worse before they get better. I just didn't know how much worse things would get. Following weeks. Looking back, I should have known better. As a healthcare worker, I've seen how denial can make people's behavior escalate. Expecting James to simply accept the truth and disappear was as naive as expecting a patient to accept a difficult diagnosis without question. His car started appearing everywhere, parked near our street, lingering around the neighborhood. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, the same way some of my elderly patients sometimes think they're being watched. But when I mentioned it to David during breakfast before his hospital shift, his concerned expression validated my fears. We began documenting everything, treating it like we would a patient's case file. Every sighting, every unexpected appearance, every time his car sped away when we noticed it. Particularly troubling were the times we spotted his car near my mother's house, the house where we spent most of our weekends. 2 weeks later, "We need to go to the police," David said one evening, reviewing the photos we'd collected of James' car in various locations. As medical professionals, we both understood the importance of documentation and proper channels. The police station felt cold and impersonal, reminiscent of hospital waiting rooms. We presented our evidence, photographs of his car near our house, my mother's house, timestamps, locations. The response was frustratingly familiar to anyone who's worked in healthcare. Without proof of immediate danger, they couldn't take preventive action. At Spencer's school. Then James crossed a line that made my blood run cold. He began lingering around Spencer's school. As healthcare workers, both David and I understood risk assessment, and this was setting off every alarm bell in our professional experience. Thank goodness for Sarah Wilson, our neighbor, and a teacher at Spencer's school. She shared our concerns immediately, understanding the gravity of the situation, as only someone who works with children can. "We'll create a safety protocol," she assured us during an emergency meeting with the school administration. "Just like our medical emergency procedures, but for this specific situation. We made it clear to everyone in the office. Spencer was only to leave with David, myself, or Sarah Wilson. No exceptions, no matter what story anyone might tell." The attempt. It happened on a Tuesday. James walked into the school office, casual as any parent, claiming there was an emergency with Spencer's grandmother, even using my mother's name to add credibility. The front office staff, following our protocol exactly, insisted they needed to call me first. James, showing his true colors, tried to prevent this by claiming I was too busy with the emergency to be disturbed. When he couldn't convince them, he left, pretending he would call me himself. Instead, he sat in his car outside the school, waiting, like a predator stalking its prey. The school called me immediately at the senior living facility where I was working. My hands shook as I listened to their report, but years of handling medical emergencies helped me stay focused. We had a plan, and now it was time to execute it. That afternoon, while other students were released as usual, Spencer stayed safely in Sarah Wilson's classroom. The police, armed with the school's security footage, found exactly what they needed in James' car: 2 plane tickets to his home state and prescription sedatives. His plan was clear. He had intended to drug my child, my legally adopted son, and take him across state lines. The police arrested him on the spot. Legal proceedings. After months of legal proceedings, the nightmare finally ended. James received a prison sentence. I won't specify the exact length to maintain anonymity, but it's long enough to give us peace of mind. The charges included conspiracy to commit kidnapping, endangering a minor, and several other counts. In the courtroom, surrounded by the sterile formality that reminded me so much of hospital administration meetings, the truth finally came to light. The DNA test officially confirmed what we already knew. Spencer was David's biological son. My medical records from a decade ago were entered into evidence, documenting the miscarriage I suffered after leaving James. The final confrontation. But the real drama came from an unexpected source. Sarah showed up at the trial, creating a scene that would have been almost comical if it wasn't so disturbing. She played the role of the devastated friend, crying about how James didn't deserve prison. The truth about their relationship finally emerged, like a long-hidden diagnosis finally coming to light. Whether their affair had started during our marriage, before it, or after our separation didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Sarah had orchestrated everything, manipulating James while maintaining her own marriage. Her performance at the trial backfired spectacularly. Her husband, apparently unaware of her ongoing obsession with James, publicly ended their marriage through a social media comment on one of her many posts supporting James. "Since you can't stop talking about him," he wrote, "you're free to support him in prison." Present day. As a geriatric care nurse, I've learned that closure comes in many forms. Sometimes it's peaceful, like a patient passing surrounded by family. Sometimes it's messy, like family members fighting over end-of-life decisions. Our closure came through the justice system. David and I have restraining orders now, legal documents protecting us, Spencer, and even the school. James will never be allowed near Spencer's school again without facing immediate arrest. The official paternity test and my old medical records are sealed in the court documents, permanent proof of the truth. Epilogue. Sarah, true to form, couldn't resist sending one final email. Her message was filled with the same venom she'd always had, gloating about how she'd won because her lies had successfully destroyed my marriage to James. For once, I didn't maintain my professional composure. I responded, something we often advise families not to do in hostile situations. But sometimes, as I've learned in healthcare, the proper approach isn't always the right one. I told her exactly what she'd won: a pathetic man who would spend years in prison for trying to kidnap a child who wasn't even his. Then I blocked her email address, finally closing this chapter of my life. The most ironic part? As a nurse who specializes in geriatric care, I've seen countless times how blood relations don't guarantee love or care. Family is built on love, trust, and dedication. Exactly what I have with David and Spencer. Sarah and James never understood that, and now they never will.